Good afternoon. This is WAIB's third session, Paving the Way on Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Tina Ramkalawan. She is director at the graduate school at Brunel University, London. Tina has a background in multidisciplinary collaborative research with expertise in psychology, health and medical research. She is part of various sector working groups, including VITA working groups on researcher careers and on PGR well-being and mental health. She has a keen understanding of UK higher education and an interest in emerging challenges and developments around research culture. I met Tina in October at a conference on the mental health and well-being of PhD researchers, and I found her talk on supporting researchers of color enlightening and tremendously inspiring. Tina, welcome. Could you share some insights with our international business community?
Thank you, Noemi, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation and to share some of our insights. I don't really know where to start, because I guess there's kind of a lot, and there's sort of a big context. But I think just generally to position some of the things that we've been doing at Brunel University, it's worth just sort of bearing in mind the fact that we still have a large degree of inequity within the academy. And within UK higher education. So that's really the backdrop to the work that we've been doing. The fact that, in the UK we have, I think it's 23,000 and climbing professors in the university sector, and just about 1% of those are Black professors. And of course, when we start to think about women, Black female professors, that number is tiny. I think we're still struggling to push more than 100, if not 150. So, we have a long way to go. And I think it's fair to say that about 2.5 years ago, suddenly there was a lot of focus on inequity. And so fortunately, that's acted as a catalyst, I think, to spur on some conversations for people to start to really think about how they might address the problem. And the UKRI chief exec, for example, was very clear in 2020 about the stark reality of the inequity as highlighted through the data, as once they finally sort of looked at it and started to explore it. So against that backdrop, obviously I am a researcher of colour to all intents and purposes, and I'll say a little bit more about that term, because that term may be a term that resonates with some people. It may be a term that people question. It may be a term that people sort of wonder, why use that term? Why not use BAME? So BAME is more commonly the group that we're talking about, so Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. But we've chosen to sort of run a project over the last year or so where we have called our BAME researchers of colour. And that's a name that comes from them. That's a term that they very much identified as being the term that they would like to see themselves referenced by. But so this work started against that general backdrop, with me in my position as graduate school director, always thinking about, what's happening for our researchers of colour. And it's more than just who's coming into the academy at a postgraduate level. It's more about, what sort of experience are they having? What's it like once they're here? Are they staying? We know when we look at undergraduate data, and that extends into postgraduate data, that with our Black, Asian, minority, ethnic students right across the board, they come in, but they're also more likely to drop out. And also when we look at patterns and we start to think about the future, we can see that we have a lot of students of colour coming into the university sector. So they're coming in larger numbers, but they're not necessarily staying. And they're not necessarily entering that academic pipeline beyond undergraduate study. So moving into masters and then moving into research. So these are all questions that, you know, are very prevalent within the academy, are very much part of the discourse, are regularly considered, I'm sure, by all institutions. So at Brunel, I think I just wanted to be able to create a space where we could start to have a conversation with the researchers themselves. I saw a lot happening in the higher education sector that talks about the people that are in it without necessarily talking to the people that are in it. And so we created some discussion groups, and I suppose potentially controversially, but hopefully not, we made those discussion groups spaces of colour. So you could only enter the discussion group if you identified as a researcher of colour. We removed all staff from those discussion groups. So the discussion groups were facilitated by a really experienced facilitator who is also a researcher of colour. And the invitees, the people taking part, came from two different London universities. That was Brunel and Westminster University. Facilitated by an experienced facilitator who is also a doctoral researcher, but at a third university. So you've got this very inclusive space for all researchers of colour, whoever sort of wants to come into it, to discuss a variety of things relating to the experience of being a doctoral researcher in UK higher education. And, you know, we found some interesting things through those discussion groups. We found that, first of all, those researchers that chose to engage found the discussion groups really, really beneficial. And one of the questions that we asked them, or one of the questions that they were asked to consider and discuss, was how appropriate is it that they are brought together under one common umbrella? Because, of course, within the category of researchers of colour or BAME, we've got a huge amount of diversity. So one of the questions that we asked within the discussion groups is, you know, how appropriate is it? How, you know, what sense of belonging do you have when you come together as this, you know, really, really mixed group, a really diverse group of researchers, but you're all kind of lumped together under this sort of common umbrella, because this is very much the way in which we talk about, you know, anybody that is not white within the academy. And I think the really interesting thing that came out quite clearly from them is that they said, look, through our discussions, we find that we have so much more in common than we don't. And collectively, we probably will have a bigger voice than we would have separately. So although they recognized the nuances, they celebrated that, they would bring those nuances, those ethnic and cultural nuances into their conversations, and obviously it would influence their thinking, their experiences. They were actually very welcoming of the opportunity to come together, and they could see the advantages of being collectively under one umbrella. And of course, this is why they sort of eventually settled on the, you know, we will use the label researchers of colour, and we'd like to carry on in this process. So on the back of that, on the back of the outcomes of these discussion groups, I thought it would be quite good to explore providing some very specific support for our researchers of colour. Again, providing them with a safe space to come together where they didn't really have to think about being potentially in a minority within those spaces. And where they might perhaps feel more relaxed and more comfortable about opening up about their experiences, but also in terms of engaging in development for themselves. And so the first aspects of these opportunities, I suppose, that we provided consisted of a coaching program that's called Elevate. And I very specifically sourced a coach who is herself a Black woman. So a Black female coach. We co-designed this program for the researchers. She was already is already a very experienced coach, but had not worked specifically in the academy with researchers per se. So it was also a really valuable opportunity to try and grow that provider space, to diversify that space, because of course, when I look at our provider profile, again, there is a lack of diversity there. So it was an opportunity to do that. And then we also provided some writing workshops with a Royal Literary Fund fellow. And she's a white woman, but very much engaged in the process, very much an ally. So we engaged her in that process. And then we also provided some specialist careers advice. The other thing that we did was we culminated, so this whole series of activities culminated in a Researchers of Colour symposium, which was held centrally. So would it be helpful? So that's kind of just an overview of what we did. Would it be helpful to kind of share some reflections on?
Yes, please. Yeah, that would be amazing. And also, where do you see the impact of all of these amazing efforts?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, we sort of entered it without any preconceptions. It really was driven by the researchers and by the discussions that were emerging through these discussion groups. I think in terms of the link with mental health and well-being, I think it's really helpful to say something about that. So this didn't start off as a project that was focused on mental health and well-being for this group. But what was really interesting was the first coaching session occurred. So we invited people to take part in this program. The invitation went out to everybody that might identify as a researcher of colour by taking the really gross metrics that we have within our systems. And I think that's the same across a number of institutions. So we invited everybody that fell into the categories of, or had self-identified somehow as being Black or Asian or other, a term that of course we don't particularly like, but Black, Asian, other, minority, ethnic in some capacity. And we told them about the program. We said, please, we're inviting people to take part. And it was very much as a pilot. So we were just looking for a small number of researchers. So we ended up with 8 researchers on the program. And what was interesting was the first coaching session that they had with the coach. I heard they relayed to me afterwards that they just all broke down and cried, which was really shocking, and it was really surprising. So just the process of finding themselves in a space where, using their own words and feedback, they were saying things like, we didn't feel judged. We felt that our feelings were validated without any labels being attached to us, like labels like, you're too emotional, you're too aggressive, or you've misinterpreted something. Just that process of introducing themselves, but in a very authentic way, introducing themselves in a very safe way, not finding that they didn't have to pretend to be a particular person within the constraints of the university system meant that they were able to tap into some really deep held emotions and some sensitivities. And so I heard, at the end of the first session, that they had literally just cried. And that was actually quite shocking and quite upsetting. So continuing this process was really interesting. So they were all very engaged. They sort of went through this series of coaching workshops, then engaged with the other providers around the writing and around the careers. And I think by then had just felt more comfortable in terms of opening up. And one of the reflections from the Royal Literary Fund fellow that had supported the writing intervention was that she was actually really shocked and surprised pleasantly by how open they were when they arrived at that stage of the process. So she said they had opened up in a way that, although she had worked with, all of the researchers, including, researchers of colour within the Academy for a number of years, she had never experienced any researcher of colour coming to her with so much openness. And she very much felt that it was because they were part of this programme, because they had been enabled to recognise that they could just be themselves, they could come as who they are to the process. And as a consequence, seem to be getting something really positive from it.
Fantastic. So how do you think this can be scaled up to reach more researchers?
Well, I don't think it's anything complicated. I don't think it's rocket science.
So is it just a matter of funding, or what is it that universities would need to put in place?
Yeah, I think it took quite minimal amounts of money. It really did. I mean, we had no specialist funding. We just sort of tapped into some resources that we had available. The overall cost was minimal. I'd say where the effort comes is in being truly willing to establish a network, to facilitate a network, in really, I think for us as the ones that are working within the Academy, being willing to diversify our own network so that we're able to tap into providers and we're able to tap into expertise that is quite diverse, that we can then pull into these processes and pull in to support these processes. In terms of cost, I would say it's fairly minimal. I mean, anybody that has a training budget and is organising training and development for researchers, most universities will have a graduate school or a doctoral college or a research development centre, something like that. I'd say that the resources were well within the general scope of cost and activity that is generally associated with those areas. And I think it's about creating a space where you are genuinely giving the power and the voice to those researchers that are involved. I think the big difference was that we said it was a space for researchers of colour. We had a researcher of colour facilitating the process. And I know that some people might think that that's strange or might wonder why that's necessary. But I think contextually it's necessary because so much of what happens involves this kind of, gazing at the researchers or wanting something from the researchers, sort of let me understand your process so that I can somehow do something with that information. And so it's less about facilitating the process with them at the center of the process. It's more about facilitating something, utilizing their experience and knowledge in order to drive forward the process. So I don't think it's about embedding them. So the co-creation is really key. Listening to them is key. for providing safe space, I think, is key.
Thank you. These are very, very useful guidelines. I think especially the comment about that the person facilitating should be a researcher of color themselves, or the facilitator, because I'm guessing that will also open up the space for more trust. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we were really lucky that we had a really, we were able to identify a really experienced facilitator. So she was just extremely skilled in that regard, but she also happened to be a doctoral researcher herself. So going through the process. But I also think it's part of, there's a broader conversation, because, we will see lots of discussion about, we need more. I mean, I'm going to say Black researchers for shorthand, because I think it's Black researchers that are particularly not represented within the academy. So I'm going to say Black researchers for shorthand. But, there's lots of discussion about, we don't have enough Black researchers, or scholarships do not tend to go to Black researchers. I mean, the statistics speak for themselves, and they're really, really shocking. But there's a whole web of activity that sits around what we do. So there's less conversation about, well, do we have Black providers? In terms of skills development, professional development, etc. Who are we bringing in to support some of the activities that we're doing? So again, it was just very fortunate that I happened to have a relationship with a Black coach, and she is quite rare. But again, it's that question of, why are there not more diverse coaches? Why is that pool? Why is that area not as diverse as it might be? And in actual fact, just as an aside, one of the outcomes of the process was that one of the researchers that was participating in the process, at the end of the process, when we get to the career development activities, they had decided that they actually wanted to move into that space and become a coach after they complete their doctorate. So there are other questions. It's about that whole web of activity. It's about that whole web that sits around research, not just about having a conversation about diversifying postgraduate research and postgraduate researchers. But what happens over and above that? What happens in the other areas? There are lots of roles within the university business that are within the academy, but sit outside of academia per se, but where the skills of a researcher are highly valued. So we find more and more postdocs moving into these other professional roles, into these other professional spaces, into the third space, so to speak, that sort of space between academic and non-academic. So I think it's about broadening the conversation to think about, well, what do all those areas look like? And how do we encourage more diversity in those areas too, and more equity and inclusion?
Thank you. I mean, this kind of segues into my next question, which is about the broader initiatives of universities around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think now almost every university is moving into that space. So if you zoom in on those, what do you think is already working fairly well, and what other areas are there that would need to be improved?
Well, Noemi, if I had the answer to that question, a really comprehensive answer to that question, I kind of, things would be sorted for me, occupation-wise, for a while. I'd be in demand, wouldn't I? I think it's really difficult. I think what I see is that, the good things are, we're talking about it more. It's almost like ED&I is this acronym, isn't it, that is almost everywhere. There should be no strategic conversation within our universities that does not involve EDI in some capacity. But I also think therein lies a problem. I think it becomes, or has potentially become, this acronym that is thrown around. You know, let's mention EDI, let's talk about equality or equity, diversity and inclusion. But what we need to take care about is ensuring that that doesn't lose its meaning. Ensuring that the conversations are meaningful and that they are coupled with some real actions for change. My own reflections are that that doesn't happen enough, that there is still a lot that needs to be done. In the broader sense, I also think it's very challenging in the sense that, you know, intersectionalities are very real. They need some complex and involved conversations and understanding. Intercultural issues are very real. That needs some nuance and understanding. So I think trying, or sort of imagining that if we just sort of if we talk about ED&I, if we put the acronyms in our strategies, you know, somehow we've just dealt with it. You know, if we, you know, tweak around the edges, you know, somehow we fixed it. I think there are issues that are systemically very deep. They're very embedded. They will take time to rectify, but we all need to be pulling in the same direction. And I think we still have a lot of misunderstanding. I think there is still a lot of learning that needs to be done. I think there are still groups that are marginalized beyond ethnicity. There are groups that are still marginalized, so that we're not as inclusive spaces as we should be and as we need to be. Some of the ways forward, I think the challenge that maybe people don't assume is a challenge is enabling people to bring all of their opinions to the table, good and bad, for want of a, you know, I don't mean to sort of judge, but, you know, right or wrong, good or bad, you know, informed, uninformed. We need to be able to bring all of those voices to the fore, because I think only then can we truly start to have meaningful conversations about what we need to change. And I think people just need to bring a real authenticity and honesty to those conversations. So I do think we have various people in the academy who know how to say the right things and use the right words in the right order. Does it mean that that then translates into action for change? I'm not sure. I think a really honest look at some of the policies that we still have within our institutions that implicitly reinforce biases need examining. So I think there's still lots of work to do. And I'm sorry if that all sounds a bit vague, but no, those are my general thoughts.
Thank you. And I think this brings back the conversation to the beginning about the safe space, right? Because, I mean, in order to bring all these opinions to the fore and authenticity, there needs to be a safe space where this is enabled.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It does all connect up to that in the end. But it's an easy thing to say, isn't it? It's kind of making it happen is the bigger challenge. And I've seen, I mean, even at our own institution, I've seen us go through some tricky periods. There's still some thorny issues. You know, there is this natural reaction, I think, in some areas to actually close down the conversation rather than, you know, wash the dirty linen in public, so to speak. But I don't see how that ultimately helps or takes us forward. But yes, creating those safe spaces that people choose to engage in and play a part in creating, rather than just having those spaces imposed on them, assuming that those spaces need to look a certain way. I think is quite important for us to get away from thinking.
I think that's a tall order, how to create the safe space and make people feel that it's not imposed. So I'm not sure whether you have any advice of
I just think they have to be part of the they have to be part of the creation, have to be part of the solution. I think it's less about, so, you know, I see senior management fall into the trap all the time of thinking that, you know, they sit in a room separately and come up with some solutions, and then they're going to, you know, roll those solutions out or propose those or create that or do that. And there are always missed opportunities to just talk to the communities that sit within our universities. And these are such rich communities, aren't they? They're full of so many different groups and so many different voices. And I don't think we truly make the most of including all of those voices in our conversations and in our planning. There is still, you know, UK universities are still they're very conservative organisations that operate in quite a conservative way, ironically. And, you know, they have inherited structures, and maybe some of those structures limit our ability to do things differently. So I think there are opportunities still to do things differently. And I think to engage everybody at earlier stages in the conversation and at earlier stages of the process of planning solutions.
Thank you. I think this is the best summary that anybody could wish for. Tina, thank you very much for taking the time and for doing this interview with me.
Noemi, you're very, very welcome. Thank you so much.